Growing up, I ate lunch with my maternal grandparents every other Sunday. They lived in a large, cold apartment and showed their affection in a restrained manner. So I spent most of my time sitting in a chair, trying to behave. From there, I could see the photograph of a serious man hanging on the wall, and the spine of a bright yellow book piled up on a shelf among brown and black ones. Years later, I went back to that apartment to help my parents move its contents into storage. When taking down the photograph, I noticed that it was signed on the back by Baron Max von Oppenheim. And when I opened the yellow book, I found an envelope inside. The back was stamped with Max Freiherr von Oppenheim, Berlin, Charlottenburg, Savigny-Platz 6. The envelope was addressed to Mr. Faek Borkhoche, Beirut, Syria. Inside the envelope was the postcard of what looked like the sculpture of a bird, and the business card that read, in French, "The Baron Max Oppenheim, Minister of Germany, wishing you a good and happy New Year. Kind regards, Berlin, December 20th, 1932. I was confused. How did memorabilia belonging to a member of the German nobility come to find itself in the dining room of a relatively quiet Lebanese family? My mother's answer was simple and direct. It is all a spy story. And this is how the story goes. Early one morning, a Bedouin tribe went to bury their elder on a hill. While digging his grave, they came upon a large stone sculpture of an animal with a human head. Taken aback and scared, they covered it up and went looking for another burial site. That year, their land suffered from an unprecedented drought. It was invaded by a swarm of locusts, and there was a cholera outbreak. The tribe attributed these misfortunes to evil spirits hiding in the stone that had been set free when the statue was unearthed, and they started to think of ways that they could rid themselves from the curse that had befallen them. When Max von Oppenheim arrived to the village of Tell Halaf in the summer of 1899, the tribesmen then told him the story of gods, demons, and monsters hiding underground, hoping that the curiosity of this foreigner would lead him to dig up the statue so that the curse would be carried away from them. Max only intended to stay in Tell Halaf for one night. At the time, he was a 39-year-old German diplomat living in Cairo on his way to Baghdad to establish a route for the railroad that would connect Baghdad to Berlin. The story fired his imagination. So, armed with a shovel, he went to the site of the buried gods. By the end of the day, he had discovered a few more sculptures. But that night, an urgent letter arrived to his campground, ordering him to return immediately to Berlin. Surprised, he reburied the statues and promised to come back as soon as he could. It would take him 12 years to obtain the necessary authorization from the Ottoman Empire and return to look for his buried treasure. That was when Max found the remains of an entire city hidden under the plains of Tell Halaf. His greatest discovery was a palace whose facade included a 5-meter-high portico depicting gods standing on animals, and a burial ground with the figure of a seated woman. But World War I broke out before Max could share his finds with the Ottomans, and he was forced to evacuate, leaving everything behind. In 1927, at the age of 67, Max returned to Tell Halaf for the third time. By then, the Ottoman Empire had been partitioned, and the village was now in Syria, under the governance of the French Mandate. Max brought along with him Igor von Yakimov, a Russian sculptor who specialized in plaster works, to make full-scale replicas of several of the ruins, so that each governing body, in addition to taking their share, would receive a replica of what they did not own. Following the division of the finds, the material that remained in Syria was transported to Aleppo and formed the major endowment of the National Museum of Aleppo, founded in 1931. On his return to Berlin, Max tried to find a home for his share of the finds. He approached the second Pergamon Museum, which was under construction at the time, but was unsuccessful. Undeterred, he decided to establish his own museum, a private institution known as the Tell Halaf Museum in Berlin. Housed in a museum in a former factory in Charlottenburg. The Tell Halaf Museum quickly became an important touristic attraction, since it did not differentiate the archaeological finds from rugs and costumes, and did not follow the usual rules of conservation and chronology. Among the many visitors were British archaeologist Max Mallowan and his wife, crime novelist Agatha Christie, who recalls, in her memoirs, being shown around by von Oppenheim for a grueling 5-hour visit, during which he stopped his speech to say lovingly, "Ah, my beautiful Venus," as he looked up to the statue of a seated woman. On November 22, 1943, the Tell Halaf Museum in Berlin was hit by a phosphorus bomb. With temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, all the artifacts were destroyed, except for objects made from basalt, a volcanic rock that could withstand heat. But when firefighters came to douse the flames, the sudden temperature change between the cold water and the hot stone shattered all the artifacts. Despite logistical difficulties, the director of the Museum of the Ancient Near East in Berlin managed to get the shattered fragments crated up on behalf of von Oppenheim. And in August 1944, 9 truckloads full of rubble were brought to the cellars of the Pergamon Museum to await an uncertain fate. Max von Oppenheim died at the age of 86. He's buried in Bavaria under a basalt replica of the bottom half of the seated goddess he so admired. After the war, the Pergamon Museum was in East Berlin, while the burnt-out Tell Halaf Museum was in West Berlin. So nothing could be done with fragments housed in a museum in the East, but owned by a family living in the West. It was only after the reunification of Germany in 1990 that an agreement allowed restorers to handle the fragments. The Reconstruction Project began in August of 2001. Some 27,000 basalt fragments were laid out on 200 wooden pallets. By 2010, 25,000 fragments had been reassembled into 30 sculptures and architectural elements. Fractures remained visible, with no attempt made to disguise them, and molten glass from the roof of the destroyed Tell Halaf Museum was left on the surface of the sculptures. The 2,000 remaining fragments that could not be identified or matched against anything are kept in several crates and cabinets in the storage rooms of the Pergamon Museum, which is undergoing a major renovation due to be completed in 2035. When that day will come, the restored facade of the ruler's palace of Tell Halaf will serve as the entrance to the ancient Near East collections. Meanwhile, the conservators at the National Museum in Aleppo are piling up sandbags around the plaster replica of that same facade while they wait for a lull in the war in Syria. Just then, I interrupted my mother and asked, I thought this was a spy story. So, where are all the spies? Well, she said, this is when it gets a little complicated. When I was a child, my grandfather, your great-grandfather, used to tell me a story how back in 1929, the governing authorities of the French mandate stationed in Lebanon sent him to be Max von Oppenheim's secretary and to gather information on the archaeological dig he was carrying out in Tell Halaf. At the time, the Germans needed to make detailed maps of North Africa and the Levant for a possible military attack there. But since these areas were under British and French rule, map making had to be done secretly. So intelligence officers, disguised as ethnographers and archaeologists, were sent on fake survey missions there. The French were suspecting that von Oppenheim was one of these intelligence officers because they knew that for the past 30 years he had been going back to the same location on the border between Syria and Turkey, and they were afraid that he was radicalizing the Bedouin tribes there and preparing an undercover coup against the colonial powers. So it seems that my great-grandfather's job was basically to spy on a suspected spy. He wrote a report on everything Max did and sent it back to Beirut for the French to analyze. Alongside this material, he sent photographs to my great-grandmother, keeping her informed of his movement. This one was her favorite. Dear Victoria, I kiss you. I kiss Joseph, Albert, and Marie, and wish you all good health. This is a photograph of the snake I caught hidden under a Bedouin's tent. After showing it around, I killed it. The next day, a photographer took this portrait of me holding it. I'm standing and my tent is behind to my right. All is well here except the unbearable scorching heat. Send me your news and send my regards to all the neighbors. My best wishes and 1,000 kisses to the kids. Yours, Faek Tell Halaf, June 1929. The French were unable to find anything on Max. So, when his expedition ended in the fall of 1929, my great-grandfather's mission was curtailed, and he went back to his day job as a government employee who translated documents from Arabic to French. When my great-grandfather died in 1981, he had nothing of value to leave behind, except a goat hair rug that had been given to him by the Bedouins of Tell Halaf. So it was his wish that the 20-meter-long rug should be divided equally among his 5 children, with the request that they, in turn, divide it among their children, and so on and so forth, until the rug eventually disappears. But his youngest daughter did not get married, so her piece, which is 1/5 of the original rug, remained intact. His second son, my grandfather, had 2 children, my mother and my uncle. My uncle's piece is 1/2 of 1/5 of the original rug. My mother has 2 children, my sister and me. My piece is 1/2 of 1/2 of 1/5 of the original rug. My sister has 2 daughters, Yasmina and Noor. Each of their pieces is 1/2 of 1/2 of 1/2 of 1/5 of the original rug. As of today, the rug has been divided in 23 pieces across 5 generations. For this presentation, I was able to loan back 5 of these pieces. During Max's initial excavation in 1911, he discovered all along the palace's back wall a sequence of 194 stone slabs. The slabs had been carved in low relief. They alternated between black basalt and red painted limestone to form a narrative frieze of imagery that included animals, plants, deities, and scenes from daily life. Prior to their dispersal, the reliefs were meant to be drawn, photographed, measured, and replicated in plaster. But due to the sudden outbreak of World War I, this work was left unfinished, and Max shipped a portion of the materials he had found to Alexandria. In 1914, a British naval ship seized the cargo of a German cruiser that had set sail from Alexandria bound to Berlin. On board were 15 of the Tell Halaf reliefs. Because the cargo was considered as enemy property, the British government took ownership of the artifacts and offered them for sale. In 1920, the reliefs entered the collection of the British Museum in London. In 1927, Max returned to Tell Halaf to continue his excavation. While taking an inventory of the ruins he had left behind, he noticed that 55 of the reliefs had disappeared. In 1929, at the end of his expedition and following the division of finds with the French, 35 of the reliefs were transported to Aleppo to be put on display in the National Museum of Aleppo. In 1930, while taking the artifacts out of their crates to set up the inaugural exhibition of the Tell Halaf Museum in Berlin, Max realized that 6 of the reliefs had gone missing en route from Alexandria to Berlin. In 1932, shortly after opening the Tell Halaf Museum in Berlin, Max traveled to New York to try selling 8 of the Tell Halaf reliefs. He arrived shortly after the stock market crash and failed to find a buyer. So he placed the reliefs in the storage facility of a local art dealer and returned to Berlin. On March 11, 1942, President Roosevelt signed an executive order establishing the office of the Alien Property Custodian, whose mandate was the seizure of material that belonged to U.S. enemy on U.S. soil. Under the terms of this order, the 8 reliefs that Max had left in the care of the local art dealer were removed from storage and put up for auction. The Walters Art Museum in Baltimore and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York each acquired 4 of them. In 1943, when the director of Berlin's Museum of the Ancient Near East came to assess the damage caused to the Tell Halaf Museum by the bombing, he noted that 12 of the reliefs had been destroyed beyond repair. In 1972, the National Museum in Aleppo and Damascus donated 140 objects for the founding of the Deir ez-Zor Museum, an institution devoted to the history and archaeology of northeast Syria. One of the objects from Aleppo was a relief from Tell Halaf. In 1932, Max wanted to thank the French authorities for their cooperation in his excavation in Syria, so he donated 3 reliefs to the Louvre Museum in Paris. In 2016, the museum acquired a 4th relief from the great-grandson of a French soldier who had served during World War I. The soldier had been stationed near Tell Halaf and claimed to have bought the relief from a Bedouin tribesman. So, as of today, from the 194 reliefs excavated in Tell Halaf, 59 are in Berlin, 4 are in Paris, 15 are in London, 4 are in New York, 4 are in Baltimore, 34 are in Aleppo, 1 is in Deir ez-Zor, 12 were destroyed, and 61 have disappeared. In 2006, a joint German team of excavators went back to Tell Halaf to continue the work Max had left behind 77 years earlier. They went back again 5 more times until their expedition was cut short in 2011 with the start of the uprisings. Today, Tell Halaf sits on the border between Syria and Turkey in an area that is under Kurdish governance. Not long before Max died, he sent a letter to the director of Berlin's Museum of the Ancient Near East, telling him that in the future, if ever there will be someone in charge of putting together the destroyed artifacts, then Kopf hoch, Mut hoch und Humor hoch, which can be translated as chin up, good luck, and keep smiling.